Hey, welcome to Further in Christendom. I'm here today with Michael Lofton. How you doing today, Michael?
I'm making it. How about yourself, Tyler?
Yeah, I'm making it, but I'm not as famous as some of us that are in this conversation right now. Um, Recently you had Cardinal Zen respond to kind of your approach or critique of him that you made in reference to Pope Francis, and it kind of blew up Twitter a little bit, or X, or whatever we want to call it. And so, yeah, what happened there? Can you tell us any more about that?
Yeah, so I noticed a few months ago, whenever Pope Francis promulgated Fiducia Supplicans with the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. This is that document that addresses blessing for same-sex couples in addition to other things. Well, I noticed that he said that this is heretical. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. I've never seen Cardinal Zen. I've interviewed Cardinal Zen before. I thought he was good and faithful Catholic. But here, Cardinal Zen is now accusing the papal magisterium of teaching heresy. And I thought, well, first of all, this is not true. It's not even heretical. He has a misunderstanding about the document. But number two, there are prohibitions against people speaking out against the Holy See and accusing it of heresy by ecumenical councils. So there's two problems here. Well, I guess three. Number one, it isn't true. Number two, he's not in a position to judge whether or not this is heresy and judge the Holy See. And number three, he shouldn't be expressing that publicly. And so I mentioned it at the time. This is very problematic behavior, but we're seeing a lot of people doing this at this point. So he's hardly unique in that regard. And time passed a little by, and then I saw him um, praising Taylor Marshall and even some aspects of Vigano, though he says he disagrees with some aspects of Vigano, who's being excommunicated right now by the church because he says that Francis isn't the Pope, so he's a sedevacantis. Um, he says he admires some things about Vigano, but has some disagreements. But he effectively says, "Hey, I watched the Taylor Marshall show that promotes Vigano all the time, and I love the content there, but it has, a little bit of an issue when it comes to this." Situation of the hermeneutic of continuity in relation to the Second Vatican Council. Because long story short, what Taylor Marshall did is he showed what Vigano says about Vatican II, and he was effectively saying that Vigano is noting that there's discontinuity here, there's rupture here. Vigano has also now said that it's not even an ecumenical council, it's not valid, it teaches heresy, and so on.
My
So he
favorite
attacks
ecumenical
that.
council, at least from the
Is
second
that right?
this
Yeah.
from this millennium, at least.
Is that right? From this millennium. That's funny. Well, there's certainly some interesting ones from this millennium. That's for sure. I'm curious now. What's your favorite one from the first millennium?
Yeah, Nicaea probably. Yeah.
Nicaea, yeah, Nicaea one. Yeah, that's cool. Well, so Vigano has this very problematic view of Vatican II, and he's promoting the hermeneutic of rupture when it comes to ecumenical councils. So Cardinal Zen, thinking that he is in line with Ratzinger's hermeneutic of continuity, jumps in and he's like, yeah, I just want to gently push back on this and encourage you guys with the hermeneutic of continuity, which basically says to interpret the magisterium in continuity with things that came from the past, not with a hermeneutic of rupture. And he gently suggests the hermeneutic of continuity, and really, ultimately, he actually fails to engage their arguments, to be quite frank. But be that as it may, I reviewed this and I said, no, this is interesting. He's calling them to the hermeneutic of continuity, but he doesn't apply the hermeneutic of continuity to the papal magisterium. He calls them to it when it comes to an ecumenical council. But when it's time for him to apply that same hermeneutic to the papal magisterium, he doesn't do that, and he introduces rupture. So oddly enough, he's more similar to Taylor Marshall and Vigano on this particular point than he realizes, and he's actually not holding to the hermeneutic of continuity as proposed by Ratzinger or Benedict XVI in his 2005 Christmas address, because the hermeneutic of continuity doesn't just apply to the Episcopal magisterium in an ecumenical council for Benedict. It applies to the whole magisterium. And this is why you can
The
see
ordinary magisterium.
everything.
Oh,
The
yeah.
papal magisterium, the College of Bishops, whether in an ecumenical council, ordinary and universal magisterium. So yeah, non-definitive teachings of a pope,
Mhm.
definitive teachings of a pope, non-definitive teachings of an ecumenical council, definitive teachings of an ecumenical council, you name it, all of the above, everything that is magisterial, the whole thing needs to be understood with a hermeneutic of continuity. So I respectfully pointed this out and said, look, this is incredibly inconsistent. This is not the legacy of Benedict. He thinks this is the legacy of Benedict. That's not at all the case. Benedict would be saying, absolutely not. What you're doing is wrong. Don't accuse the magisterium of heresy. He would be opposed to this. Um, so I point that out. And instead of engaging that content, he bypasses it, ignores it all, goes for ad hominem attacks, says, I have tattoos, I have a small beard. And it's written in a really kind of Mean Girls way. If you've ever seen that movie, Mean Girls, incredibly childish and immature. I
Yeah,
didn't think this was written by the Cardinal at first. I thought there's no way this is one of those fake accounts. Is not real.
right.
Then I go to his blog and it's actually, yeah,
Yeah,
it's actually him. I was just, that alone shocked me. Like, how could a Cardinal
right.
behave in such an immature way? It tells me that he's not used to being challenged. And it also tells me there's a considerable amount of perhaps pride here whenever a person sets themselves up as the ultimate arbiter of the magisterium and then accuses it of heresy. And then somebody comes along and challenges that. And instead of addressing the arguments and showing where they're wrong, they go for personal attacks. Then he goes into some weird stuff about how I'm not a theologian when I am. And it's just really odd. He wants
The
to say I don't even have a basic level of catechetical knowledge
right,
about.
right, right.
It's like, are you kidding me? I teach this to my students. This is absurd. So I point that out and I address all the issues point by point and kind of ignore the straw man and the ad hominems there. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. So
Yeah, one thing that made me really curious, and you might have saw this on X or Twitter or whatever. Um,
mhm.
I kept seeing like people say this was such a really strong rebuttal to Michael Lofton, and I just like I was really
Wishful thinking.
confused because like there wasn't really an argument, and it might be the case that like in reference to His Eminence, like he wasn't trying to develop arguments and that sort of thing, but the reaction from like hypertrad Twitter was that like this was like airtight
I'll tell you
logic.
why. Because every single one of those persons to the man I've refuted, every single one of them by name. Every single one of those people who are content creators or journalists, I've pointed out that they have promoted propaganda and I've pointed it out by name and shown that in their news reports. Or if they're a content creator, I've taken their comments about the magisterium and dismantled them, every single one of them. And they have not been able to respond to any of the content or the arguments. They've been silent on that end. But when they have an opportunity to throw in a jab, they always take it. So that's what this is. There was no rebuttal there, but they have to celebrate this as a victory because they're just waiting to say something about me, but they can't take me to task when it comes to the theology.
So when it comes, so I know that some have argued that um, your approach to the papacy is such that any and everything that is said is binding, no matter what context, no matter uh, what document it's in. How would you respond to that?
Yeah,
How do you
that's so.
bifurcate through, like, or how do you delineate through different
Yeah.
documents from the papacy?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a caricature made by people who have never actually watched the content. Anybody who's watched the content knows that I distinguish between acts of the papal magisterium versus private acts of the Pope that are not magisterial, not authoritative. So the Pope can speak as a private individual. He doesn't always speak as Pope. Sometimes he could be speaking just as the Bishop of Rome. He could be speaking as the Patriarch of the West. I mean, there's various
Right.
levels here. So there are contexts in which he can speak authoritatively and others where it's not authoritative. I'm always careful to distinguish between those. And when it comes to authority, I am very careful to note that there are grades here even in that. There are some things that are authoritative, but really low on the authority scale. There's some things that he could say that's really high. And so just kind of depends on what grade of authority we're employing here. And you have to look at a number of factors. Cardinal Zen, oddly enough, says that I'm ignorant of them, but I'm not. It's pretty well known. I speak about it often. You have to look at, for instance, what kind of document this is in,
Hmm.
what context, how central the proposition is to the
Hmm.
central theme of the document, the force of the language used by the magisterium. In this case, we're talking about the Pope. So the force of the language, the repetition of the language, those are just a few things that impact the weight of a theological proposition off the top of my head. There's others
So,
that we consider as
so
well.
let's think about like kind of objections.
Uh-huh.
So you might have one community,
Yeah.
um, call it, the rad trad community. And I say rad trad because I have some good traditional friends and colleagues and so forth, who I want to, not apply this sort of objection. It's not coming from them. It's coming from
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
specific community,
Sure.
right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Largely on Twitter,
Right.
um, who they'll say, okay, the seat's not empty. You know, I flirt with it a little bit, but seat's not empty nonetheless. I think Pope Francis is actually the Pope, but his papacy has been horrific, catastrophe, um,
Mhm.
a violation of all theological and moral norms, right? So,
Mm.
kind of like from this kind of background, what's sort of the best sort of objection to his papacy that you've heard of from
Mhm.
this type of crowd?
I think the ones that have really gripped the minds of most people would be Amor Laetitia, Fiducia Supplicans, and the alleged Pachamama incident. Those would probably be the top three things in this pontificate that I think have really captivated people's attention and have been a point of contention for so many people.
Let,
Now, I'm
let me
happy
give
to
you a
explore every one of
challenge.
those, but yeah, sure.
So those three areas.
Yeah,
Can you try to give me like in 2 to 3 minutes
yeah,
each
yeah,
response for why you
sure,
think these actually
sure.
aren't as bad as what's being conveyed?
Yeah, and in some ways, I'm going to be oversimplifying it. There's a lot of complexities here, but just
Understood.
like a quick
Understood.
summary fashion. Amor Laetitia, so this document, of course, was released a few years back, I think 2015, 2016. Now, this was a post-synodal apostolic exhortation released by Pope Francis after the Synod on the Family. It is magisterial. The big bombshell here was a lot of people
Yep.
took away from the document that in chapter 8, that Pope Francis was allowing for people who are living in adultery, who are in a state of mortal sin, to receive communion without going to confession. That's not in the document. There are some things that people try to understand that way. The papacy continued to give more clarifications indicating, no, that's not a proper interpretation of the document. And even most recently, the magisterium responded to another dubia or dubium. Actually, it was a dubia from Cardinal Duca on the very question of Amor Laetitia, and it explicitly asserts that Pope Francis is saying people who are in a state of adultery that are in mortal sin must first go to confession before they receive the Eucharist. They are not to be admitted to the Eucharist without going to confession if they are in a state of mortal sin. So even if somebody felt like it was previously unclear, which I want to say, no, it was sufficiently clear. But even if somebody wanted to say that, well, you can't say that now because it's abundantly clear now as of 2023 with that dubia response. So I think that one's been put to death. Number two, there's this Pachamama incident where you have Pope Francis in the Vatican Gardens for the Synod on the Amazon, brings a group of Amazonian Catholics to the Vatican, and they have a ceremony where they talk about Saint Francis of Assisi, because I think it was his feast day. They plant a tree, they do a few things, sing some hymns, and have a message or two. They have some prayers, and then there was one short little part of this gathering where the Amazonian Catholics, who are Catholics, explicitly Catholics, came out. They do the sign of the cross. They do a few gestures like that, but they have this thing where there's this figure kind of in the center of where they're gathered. And a lot of people speculated, like, what is that? It looked like it was perhaps the Virgin Mary with Elizabeth, at one point, because they're just two women positioned together and the both of them are pregnant. And during the ceremony, the image is presented to the Holy Father and it's called Our Lady of the Amazon. So it's specifically identified as the Virgin Mary. So the person who created it, the people who venerate that image say this is the Virgin Mary. Well, there's some scenes where it looks like they're venerating the image, although that's not necessarily clear, but it looks like they're venerating this image of the Virgin Mary. Well, within Catholicism, that's obviously 100% Orthodox. We venerate images of the Virgin Mary all the time. But we started to see in the news, people started to say, no, 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 that's not the Virgin Mary. It's this pagan idol, Pachamama. And there was no basis for that, zero evidence for it, but they started running with that story and it picked up traction more and more and more and more to the point that it was a narrative that was almost entirely hard to dispel. Pope Francis definitely didn't do himself any favors whenever he actually called it Pachamama at one point. He did so because that's basically what everybody's calling it at that point, but not necessarily acknowledging that that's literally what it is. And that was further clarified by the Vatican. So ultimately, there was no kind of idolatry or worship of a pagan idol, but that's the way most people saw it. And so it caused a massive fallout among Catholics, and a lot of people started to look at Pope Francis with suspicion since then. Lastly,
Yeah,
you
I
of
wonder
course
if
have
like some of these rad trads like would be okay with like Maria Canon. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in Japan, I guess would be the 16th, 17th century, somewhere along that line, along those lines, um, uh, where you had the great persecution of the Catholic faith in Japan, and so they would take a statue of Guanyin and which looks like it's a Buddhist statue, and then they put little crosses underneath it, or they put some sort of Christian symbol somewhere. Or basically, they kind of gave it a new design plan, so to speak. And they said, no,
hmm,
no, this is Mary and Jesus, even though it was originally intended to be a Buddhist statue. Um, like, would they be freaking out about this too? I mean, like,
I think
this is
so.
this is a Catholic thing, you know?
It's incredibly inconsistent because if you look at the history of Catholicism, it's filled with instances. And by the way, it goes to the Old Testament, filled with instances where we take elements from paganism,
Right,
purify them with their pagan roots, and then employ them for the worship of God. If you don't
exactly.
like that, you can't be Catholic. And so we've been doing this since the Old Covenant. So there's plenty of instances like this, but that isn't even the case with the situation with
Right,
Pachamama because
right.
it wasn't even Pachamama.
Right.
So, um, but oddly enough, we actually do have some images of the Virgin Mary depicted as Pachamama in our
Mhm.
liturgical, not liturgical, but in our Catholic history. Um, but yeah, that was a huge one. And then I think also Fiducia Supplicans was really a massive fallout for a lot of people. There was a lot of groundwork that went into giving the impression Pope Francis is about to change the church's perspective on homosexuality and blessings for gay persons. This was in part done by multiple cardinals, including Cardinal Zen, unfortunately. They were giving people the wrong impression with some really underhanded tactics that they employed when they submitted some various dubias to him and then told people, hey, here's Pope Francis's response, but they didn't actually show people what Pope Francis really said. They just summarized his response. And when people started asking for what Pope Francis actually said in response to their dubia, they said, nah, we're not going to give that to you. Fortunately, Cardinal Fernandez then came out and published what Pope Francis actually said to them. And then we realized, oh, wow, what Pope Francis actually said to them was completely different than what they said Pope Francis said. And they were going to leave us in the dark, and we would not have known the truth. And we would have been misled by these cardinals if Fernandez had not told us the truth. So it was really underhanded, but it caused a massive scandal. The media is reporting worldwide Pope Francis is getting ready to bless gay relationships and gay unions, even though the Pope had corrected them on this, told them that's not the case. That was the narrative that they were promoting. And so the international news started promoting that. Then Fiducia Supplicans drops, everybody read it in that way because the groundwork had already been laid. Even though the document is clear enough to indicate the relationship is not blessed. We're talking about blessing persons. So you might have a homosexual couple. The couple can be blessed. That is the persons, the individuals who make up this couple, that can be blessed. Not, however, the relationship of the couple. The persons of the couple, not the relationship of the couple. And so we could bless persons, and this is not an approbation for anything sinful in their life. Rather, it's a cry to God to live a holier life, to be separated from sin. Um, but the narrative has been the exact opposite, that he's blessing gay unions and that this is there to validate sinful elements in their life and to bless homosexuality. It's far from the truth, but that narrative has a strong foothold in the minds of many Catholics.
But
Like,
what's funny is kind of like what you mentioned earlier, like
mhm.
the Vatican, has, including Pope Francis himself, on multiple occasions has made it very, very clear the proper way to interpret the text. And seems to be ignored, or
They ignore it, like Cardinal Zen just ignored it in a response to me. Not only did he ignore everything I said, he also ignored what Pope Francis said, because he had the audacity to suggest that Pope Francis may not actually believe what Fiducia Supplicans says, even though he rubber stamped it. And I wanted to say, well, actually, there's multiple videos. Like, we have actual video of Pope Francis on videotape backing up what Fiducia Supplicans
right
says, the
references.
authentic interpretation of it,
That's right.
properly understood.
That's right.
So very clearly, this is the mind of Pope Francis. So you can't play this game like, well, they got one over on the Pope. He ended up rubber stamping something that he doesn't actually believe. There's no way to take that seriously. The only way you could believe that is if you live under a rock and you don't really know what is out there, and you haven't seen videos of Pope Francis confirming these things.
Yeah, I love Cardinal Zen. He's done great things for the church. As you know, I lived in China for a few years, at least in Macau, and visited the mainland a couple times. Um, I think that he's done great things. However, I am a bit puzzled here with the like smelling nose comment, or whatever that was, in reference to being able
Doesn't smell like
to
Pope Francis,
yeah,
Fiducia.
that's right,
That's
that's right.
funny.
Kind of like the sensus uh the sensus smellitatis. Those who will just say the seat is empty. What's the kind of the biggest objection that you've heard from that community as to why the seat is empty? That Pope Francis specifically, has ended the papacy, or has made this seat empty. What do you say to them?
Well, I mean, their argument generally is going to go something like, a heretic is not a Catholic, a non-Catholic can't hold office in the Catholic Church. Pope Francis teaches heresy, therefore Pope Francis doesn't hold office in the church. That's kind of how the syllogism goes, and there's a lot of problems there with this notion. First of all, Pope Francis doesn't teach heresy, so already we have an issue. Number two, even if he were privately a
Uh,
heretic, such as a material heretic, he would not necessarily lose
right.
office. He wouldn't even lose office even if he were a formal heretic. Um, so it's a little bit more difficult than they would suggest. I think the biggest thing that I would point them to is, well, two things. Number one, Vatican I talks about there will be perpetual successors. Um, if you think that Pope Francis isn't the Pope, well, you might say, well, that's just kind of right now there isn't a Pope, but
Mm,
we still have perpetual successors. It's only been 13 years, or
yeah.
not 13 years, 11 years. Okay, well, what happens when the next Pope continues to affirm what Pope Francis said, endorses his pontificate, and then the next Pope does that as well? You'll just end up in this long perpetual situation where you don't have popes and you don't have perpetual successors. But Vatican I says that there will be perpetual successors to the Pope. And then number two, I would say it's clear that Pope Francis is the Pope, and you can know that he is the Pope. For anybody who says it, it's unclear if he's actually the Pope. We don't know if he was really elected or if he really consented. You can just do this shorthand, and you could appeal to the fact that we have a theology, and Catholic theology, we have a doctrine known as peaceful and universal acceptance of a pope. And so whenever a person is um, claimed to be pope upon their election, if the church receives them peacefully and universally, then they are the pope, and that would also heal in the root any defects that there were possibly in their election. So if there were some kind of defect in the election, it heals in the root because the whole church as a whole has accepted that as their head. At the time of Pope Francis's election, he was entirely received. None of the College of Cardinals, none of the cardinals from the College of Cardinals came out and said, "Oh no, there was some stuff going on here. He wasn't actually elected." And 99.9999% of the bishops really haven't objected to him being pope. So
And what do you say to those who say, well, this doctrine that you're mentioning, it's not really a real doctrine. It's mentioned in a couple places, or it's alluded to, but this isn't actually a binding, dogma of the church or anything like that, or practice even.
maybe it's not a dogma, but I think it would be a secondary object of infallibility that's necessary to preserve dogmas, because I could just say, well, you know what, actually, this pope wasn't the pope, and now that was the same pope who promulgated the Council of Trent, and so, Pius V or something, or I could just start questioning whatever pope I want. And when I do that, I'm now undercutting everything that they promulgated in their magisterium. And that's going to lead to some deeper issues. So it's like, if that's true, what is there to stop me from saying that this or that ecumenical council isn't authentic because the person who called it wasn't actually the pope? It's going to start to undercut a lot of our teachings and even dogmas.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be necessary to maintain this fact in order to then maintain the teachings promulgated by these popes.
Yeah.
So yeah, if we start questioning these secondary objects, I think that we're going to end up undercutting our dogmas.
Mm. Very good. And then what about like an objection from like the Orthodox community, right? You will hear an objection that goes something like, "Hey, Vatican I's language, this idea of supreme and immediate jurisdiction over all the church, that's nowhere." And the first 1,000 years of the church, especially in the eastern part of the church, this is something that's maybe is an invention of the Western Church much later on. There's not even like kind of a seed form of that doctrine which could naturally develop into something like Vatican I says. It's just nothing at all. So Catholicism is false, right? How would you respond to that objection?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, scripture. I'll talk about that in just a second, but also the formula for Misdis, signed by 2,500 different bishops, would affirm this notion of papal supremacy. The council itself is appealing to multiple councils, such as Ephesus, the Third Ecumenical Council, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Constantinople III, and I think also Nicaea II, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which all do teach papal supremacy. So really, it's not new. It's just reiterating those first millennium councils, in addition to also the formula for Misdis.
But can you like a quick reference to?
Yeah, sure.
In reference to why you're saying that they teach
yeah.
supremacy.
Yeah, so let's start real quick with scripture. In Matthew 16:18-19, Jesus establishes Peter as head of the apostolic college. And generally, Orthodox are going to have to concede that, at least historically they have. But then we see that he's doing so in light of language reflecting back from Isaiah 22 that shows this will be a successive office. It won't end with Peter. And so Peter's going to have successors, where that office of being first among all of the others is going to be given to his successors, which we know historically has been with the Bishop of Rome. Now, this wasn't just the first among equals that Peter had. He had full plenary authority because he's given the keys of the kingdom. Now, we could say that in Matthew 18, the bishops or the apostles collectively are given the keys of the kingdom, but they're given it collectively in union with Peter and never apart from Peter and never individually. So Peter can exercise that authority individually without the rest. However, the rest can only exercise that authority with Peter and under Peter, so collectively. So I would point out that that same notion applies to the successors. The successor of St. Peter is able to exercise that authority, that plenary power in the church, teaching, governing, and sanctifying with the office of the keys. He could do that singly, individually, or he could do so in union with all of his brother bishops collegially, with the College of Bishops, the successors of the apostles. So it's already right there in Scripture in seed form. So I would object to anybody who says it's not in seed form.
And I think it's interesting where, when it comes to opening the gates of heaven, so to speak, for the Jews, right? Who's there, right? Where the Spirit falls. It's Peter, right? From Peter's sermon. And then you have in reference to the Samaritans, right? In fact, they needed to call Peter and John, right? To come. He's there. And then when it comes to the Gentiles in Acts 10, right? It's Peter, and his name's always listed first with the apostle. I mean, there's something clearly going on here, and I think even Pope Benedict might mention this in one of his works in reference to the restoration of Peter. That was that could have been written after Peter. Nonetheless, it's why is it important to understand that this kind of Peter's office, Peter's authority was protected or reinstituted, or however you want to parse it. So I think very clearly there's something really special with Peter that's not going on with the other apostles from Holy Spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. He's singled out and given the keys individually, whereas in the other case, it's a
any sort of interpretation that makes it such where it's like, oh no, Peter has the same exact authority. It just that doesn't seem to bear witness with the rest of these themes of Scripture, I think. But go ahead anyway. In
Yeah.
reference to church history, you mentioned Nicaea
Well,
II and Ephesus and so forth.
yeah,
Yeah,
and let me give you a perfect example from Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical
yeah. Go
Council.
ahead.
Let's briefly explore that. You have the 28th canon that the emperor tried to put forward,
Right.
which tries to paint some kind of equivalency between the papacy and Constantinople,
Constantinople. Yeah.
not necessarily in full power over the church, but just in some kind of oversight,
Right.
because Constantinople is the new Rome. So second to Rome, old Rome.
Right.
Now the problem is this would then transgress the privileges of Alexandria and also Antioch, because it undercuts them. It pushes them to the bottom and then puts Constantinople over them. Problem here is that Alexandria and Antioch are Petrine sees, not in the way that Rome is, but they are established either directly or indirectly through Peter. He doesn't discharge his plenary authority in Antioch or Alexandria, but they're still Petrine sees in one way or another, and apostolic sees. Constantinople is not. Constantinople was found later. So to just kind of climb over them in the taxes and the order of things was just not going to work, and to also equate Rome with New Rome in the way they were trying to do just wasn't going to work either. It was already refuted by Pope Damasus in 382. So when they try to put forward this canon, the Pope shoots it down immediately.
Right.
And he shoots it down by the authority of St. Peter.
Mm-hmm.
He uses really solemn and Petrine language when he does so. Now think of this. You have an ecumenical council being shot down. Its canon is being shot down by the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
How did they react? Oh, you don't have this authority over us. No, they acquiesced. The emperor acquiesced, Constantinople acquiesced, the bishops acquiesced.
Mm.
It ended up being adopted in the East later. And by the way, it ended up also being adopted by Rome later. But for a while, Rome contested it and people complied. And so clearly, Pope Leo thought that he had authority over an ecumenical council, and so did the ecumenical council and the emperor and the
Mm-hmm.
patriarch of Constantinople. So that's just one example. So we see it in scripture, we see it being manifested in history. We see cases where popes are sending out, I think Pope Theodore the First might be one, or was it Pope Martin, or both? They were sending out bishops into the East, into their territory, and replacing those bishops with bishops who are in communion with Rome, who teach the true faith.
Yeah.
And the East accepted these appointments by
Yeah.
the Holy See. And so this is clearly interfering in the affairs of the jurisdiction of another see, very clearly. So they can't say it's not immediate authority, as Vatican I puts it,
Right.
because here it is. Well,
Right.
first of all, it's in scripture.
Right.
And then number two, it's even being acted out right here in this particular case in the 7th century.
So,
With the
what would
heresy
someone who's
of
like an
Calvinism.
Orthodox theologian, how would they
Uh-huh.
respond to what you just mentioned in reference to the
Mhm.
appointments? Would they say, "Oh, he had that; it was an accidental power, or it wasn't maybe disputed, but it should have been," or what's the kind of
I've heard,
perspective?
yeah, I've heard yeah, that effectively that argument that it should have been disputed but
Okay.
wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think if you're gonna kind of rewrite history like that, you could just say all sorts of things. You could say that, well, it turns out that they should have disputed the Trinity but didn't. You could say anything at that point. So I just don't think that that one is going to slide. I think I'm going to need something a little bit more cogent than that. It seems that the entire Eastern Church accepted this.
Hmm.
If they're willing to tolerate these kinds of actions that they later deemed to be heretical, I don't know if that really bodes well for the Eastern testimony of the faith anyway.
Right.
Um, so you want to say that you all accepted
Right.
these heretical actions? It's kind of like their situation with the filioque, being in communion with the Roman Church that accepted the filioque, and the Western churches that accepted the filioque for so long and they didn't object to it. It's kind of like, well, if you didn't object to it for so long, I mean, it's kind of hard to go back and say later on that it's heresy.
No, thanks, Michael, for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you. Um, I hope that maybe we continue to talk more again, either
I'd
in your
love to
channel
do
or
it.
mine. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.